which looks at health technology assessment criteria for funding cancer drugs across the high-income countries. We looked at the G7 countries minus USA, because USA does not have a health technology assessment body, plus Australia and New Zealand. So these are all high-income countries with somewhat overlapping health systems, in that they have a health technology assessment body that looks at different parameters to decide whether or not the drug should be reimbursed for the public, and they have more or less similar health insurance systems, publicly funded drug mechanisms, as well as, in fact, they have comparable cancer mortality rates too. So what our target was in this study was to look at what is the criteria for making those decisions. How does a country say, okay, we are going to fund for this drug, but we are not going to fund for the other drug? And are those criteria similar across these 8 countries that we looked at? And we found something very interesting. One is that, yeah, they all look at some overlapping criteria or parameters. For example, they are all interested in looking at the efficacy of the drug, whether it improves any outcomes or not. They are all interested in looking at the economic impact. Is it cost effective and things like that. But we also found that there are several important differences between countries, and I think that's what these countries can learn from each other. For example, there were only 2 countries, England and Japan, that specified a specific threshold for cost effectiveness, saying that if the cost per quality adjusted life year is more than this, that will not be cost effective. But other countries, they did not have that specific number. One more difference, only Germany considered the validity of surrogate endpoints in evaluating the quality of evidence. All other countries, they did not talk anything about whether the surrogate endpoint is valid or not. New Zealand, for example, had a special provision in their parameter to think about how it affects the indigenous population. Other countries, they do not have anything specific for the indigenous population in terms of improving equity. So there are several nuances and differences between these countries, but overall the big criteria of efficacy and economic impact, they are something that all these countries consider. Next, we looked at how does this translate into differences in funding of cancer drugs in these countries. And we looked at 2 cohorts of drugs. One was the top selling cancer drugs in the US. So we took the top selling cancer drugs in the US and we tried to analyze whether these drugs were funded by these other countries or not that have a health technology assessment system in place. And we found something remarkable, that many of these countries, they decided not to reimburse several of these drugs. That means these are the drugs that the US is spending the most on, but the other countries with a health technology system, they are saying these are not worth funding. The third point was, we looked at the cohort of drugs with the marginal clinical benefit, like the least valuable cancer drugs. We defined that as the cancer drugs which have a ESMO MCBS score of 1. This score goes from 1 to 5. 5 is maximally effective, 1 is least effective or marginally beneficial. And of course, all these drugs have been approved by the FDA, and therefore the Medicare pays for it. But we found that several of these other countries that we looked into, they did not pay for these drugs. For example, New Zealand paid for 0% of these drugs. It did not pay for any of those drugs for those indications. So what it implies, and by the way, another study from a different group has shown that the cancer mortality rates across these countries are somewhat similar. There is not too much of difference. So what this tells is, America is probably spending a lot on these marginal, meaningless cancer drugs that other countries do not fund. But for all that extra expenditure, the mortality rates in America are not better than the average other country, high-income country. And 2, I think the other high-income countries can also look at each other and try to understand why they decided to fund these marginal cancer drugs, and what could have changed or how they could have improved. And third, especially for low and middle income countries, several of these low income countries, they do not have their own HTA system. So they look up to US FDA approval as a marker of quality. So if a drug is approved by the FDA, they think that, okay, this is probably a good drug, that's why it got FDA approved, so we should be using it. But what our study shows is that if we look at other high income countries, even countries like Australia, New Zealand and other countries in our cohort, even they are not funding for these drugs. So it helps in prioritization for low and middle income countries. They should not feel that, okay, all the drugs that are approved by the FDA, we should also be having access for them, or we should also fight for, having access for these drugs, or we should worse, we should pay for these drugs from the public system, or even we should ask our patients to pay for these drugs from their pocket. So I think that's the lesson in there, that even if the drug is approved by the FDA, even other high-income countries, they also don't fund for these drugs.